For as long as anyone in Caldwell County could remember, the Higgins family pond had been the one thing on the farm nobody touched. It sat behind the old hay barn, 3 acres of dark water fringed with cattails, and every farmer in the county agreed on exactly one thing about it: you don't mess with a good pond. So, when 62-year-old Walter Higgins backed a rented excavator down his gravel lane and told his neighbor he intended to drain it dry, the neighbor laughed out loud, right there in the driveway. Within a week, half the township had heard about it. Men who hadn't spoken to Walter in years suddenly had opinions. At the feed store, at the diner on Route 9, in pickup trucks idling at the 4-way stop, the question was the same. Had Walter Higgins finally lost his mind? Walter said nothing. He kept the excavator running. 3 weeks into the draining, with the water level dropping a few inches a day, something started surfacing in the exposed mud. Nobody could explain it. Walter didn't explain it either. He just kept working, calm as ever, while the whole county wondered what he'd seen in that pond that none of them ever had. What did he know that everyone else missed? If you've ever been laughed at for believing in something others couldn't see, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's discover what happened when one farmer ignored the crowd and trusted his instincts. Walter Higgins was not a man who argued. In 62 years, he had built a reputation around the opposite habit. He listened, he watched, and when he finally spoke, people tended to lean in. He'd farmed the same 110 acres his whole adult life, the same land his grandfather Earl had cleared by hand in the 1930s. And in all that time, Walter had developed one quiet, unshakable rule. Before you change anything, you study it first. For nearly a decade, he had been studying the pond. Neighbors assumed he simply liked fishing there. In truth, Walter spent those years noticing things that didn't sit right. The water level rose and fell on a schedule that had nothing to do with rainfall. In a dry August, when every other pond in the county dropped 2 feet, his barely moved. In a wet spring, when ditches overflowed everywhere else, his pond drained itself almost as fast as it filled. He started keeping a small notebook in his shirt pocket, jotting down dates, water levels, and the strange cold patch of grass that always grew faster along the pond's northeast corner, even in frost. He never told anyone what he suspected. He wasn't fully sure himself, but he had a theory, and it had been forming for 9 quiet years. The trouble started the morning he announced he was draining it. "You're killing a perfectly good pond," said Dale Petrie, who farmed the adjoining quarter section and had known Walter since grade school. "That's water you'll wish you had back come July." At the diner on Route 9, men who barely knew Walter weighed in like they'd been personally wronged. Someone said he was throwing away the only swimming hole the grandkids had left in the township. Someone else said a man his age shouldn't be operating heavy equipment alone, not without a second set of hands nearby. A third man, half joking and half not, said Walter had probably finally cracked after losing his wife 2 winters back, and that someone ought to check on him. That last comment made its way back to Walter through his sister, and it stung more than any of the others, but he never mentioned it to a soul. He just nodded when people brought it up directly, said, "Could be," and went back to work. The county extension agent, a younger man named Curtis Boyle, stopped by uninvited to politely suggest Walter reconsider, citing erosion risk and the loss of wetland habitat. Walter offered him coffee, listened to the whole presentation standing in his own driveway, thanked him for stopping by, and climbed into the excavator the moment Curtis's truck turned back onto the county road. What none of them knew was that Walter had spent the previous winter pulling old records out of a cardboard box in his attic. Earl's records going back to before Walter was born, handwritten ledgers, a few faded surveyor's notes, a hand-drawn map, brittle and water-stained, showing the original boundaries of the farm before the pond existed at all. According to Earl's notes, there had been no pond there in 1931. The pond hadn't formed naturally. Someone had dug it, or something underneath had carved it out on its own, slowly, over years, the way water does when nobody's watching. Earl had written one line in the margin of a 1958 ledger that Walter had read maybe 200 times. "Spring still runs strong under the south field. Don't ever cap it." Walter had no idea growing up what that meant. By the time he was 60, he had a guess. and guesses on a farm are worth testing. The draining itself was nothing like the simple weekend job Walter had imagined when he first called the equipment rental company. The old drainage culvert at the pond's south end had collapsed decades earlier and had to be dug out by hand before the excavator could even get a pull on it. The rented machine broke a hydraulic line on day 6, costing Walter 4 days and a repair bill he hadn't budgeted for. Mud swallowed his boots, his gloves, twice his entire left leg. He worked 12-hour days through a stretch of unseasonably hot September weather, alone, except for his old dog, Scout, who mostly just watched from the bank and barked at the herons that kept circling, confused about where their pond had gone. And the whole time, people kept driving by, slow, just to look. It was in the second week, with the water down to knee height and the cattails collapsing into the mud, that the first strange thing appeared. A patch of gravel surface near the pond's center. Not native gravel, but smooth, rounded stone that didn't match anything else on the property. Walter dug around it carefully and found more of it, laid out in what looked almost like a path, running straight toward the south field. He didn't tell anyone. He photographed it, marked the spot with a stake, and kept draining. A few days later came the setback that nearly ended the whole project. A storm rolled through overnight, dumping 2 inches of rain on the half-drained basin and turning the exposed mud into a lake of soup. The excavator sank to its frame and had to be winched out by a tow truck from town, an audience-drawing spectacle that gave the skeptics fresh material for a week. Worse, Walter's nephew Robbie, who'd been helping on weekends, started openly doubting the project. "Uncle Walt, I love you, but I think we should fill it back in before winter," Robbie said one evening, looking at the wrecked, muddy crater where a pond used to be. "This doesn't look like it's going anywhere good." Walter almost agreed with him. Standing in the ruined basin, mud past his ankles, equipment bill climbing, the whole county convinced he'd finally cracked. It would have been easy to quit. He didn't. He went back to the attic that night and read Earl's line one more time. "Don't ever cap it." Then he went back out the next morning. Once the mud firmed up enough to work again, a second find turned up that gave Walter his first real flicker of confidence in weeks. A length of hand-fired clay drainage tile, the kind farmers laid by hand in the early 1900s, running along the basin's eastern edge in a perfectly straight line that matched nothing on any modern survey. Someone, decades before Walter was even born, had gone to considerable trouble to manage water in this exact spot. That wasn't the behavior of a man dealing with an ordinary low patch of ground. The gravel path, once they uncovered the rest of it, led to something Robbie nearly tripped over. A section of old hand-laid stone, fitted together without mortar, forming a shallow rectangular basin no bigger than a kitchen table. It looked nothing like farm equipment. It looked, if anything, like a forgotten well casing, the kind men used to build by hand before anyone had heard of a drilled bore. Word got out fast. By that weekend, Dale Petrie himself came by to look at it, no longer laughing, just curious. Then came the discovery that changed everything. 3 days after uncovering the stone basin, Walter noticed water still rising inside it, even with the rest of the pond bed bone dry under the September sun. He cleared mud away from the bottom with his hands and found it. A narrow fissure in the bedrock, no wider than a dinner plate, with cold, clear water pushing steadily up through it. Not runoff, not rain. A living spring, exactly where Earl's ledger said one would be, flowing at a rate Walter estimated, once he measured it properly with a county surveyor's help, at nearly 40 gallons a minute, every hour of every day, regardless of drought. The pond had never been a pond at all. It had been a spring that nobody in 3 generations had bothered to understand, slowly filling a low spot in the land and silently keeping the whole South Field's water table higher than it had any right to be in a county where wells were going dry every August. Once the county hydrologist confirmed what Walter already suspected, the math became simple and astonishing. Properly channeled, that spring could irrigate 40 acres without a single well pump running in any drought the region had seen in the last 60 years. The same field everyone assumed Walter was sacrificing for nothing was about to become the most reliable, lowest-cost cropland in the township. By the following spring, that ground was producing the best corn yield Walter had seen in a decade, watered for free by a source that never stopped flowing. Land values on that side of the county ticked upward once word spread. The extension agent who'd shown up to caution him now brought a graduate student to study the spring's hydrology and admitted, a little sheepishly, that he'd been wrong to assume the pond was worth more intact than whatever was underneath it. Dale Petrie, the first man to laugh in Walter's driveway, was the first to ask if Walter would walk his own land with him to check if he had something similar hiding under his own low pasture. Walter said yes without hesitation. He walked Dale's property for 2 afternoons, free of charge, pointing out the same quiet signs nobody else thought to look for. Patches of grass that stayed green too long, frost that melted unevenly, a low corner where the cattle always gathered in August. They found a smaller spring on Dale's land within the month. Walter never once mentioned the comment about losing his mind, and Dale never brought it up either. Some things didn't need saying out loud once the work spoke for itself. Other neighbors started showing up too, not to gawk anymore, but to ask questions. What should they be watching for? What did frost patterns actually mean? Walter answered every one of them the same patient way he'd answered the doubters, except now people leaned in instead of laughing. 5 years on, that conversation in Walter's driveway has become something of a local legend, the kind farmers tell newcomers half as a joke and half as advice. Walter, now 67, still walks the spring-fed field most mornings with Scout's successor at his heels, and most autumns he hosts a handful of younger farmers, Robbie included, fully a believer now and managing the irrigation schedule himself, who want to learn what an old notebook and 9 years of quiet watching can teach a person that no engineering report ever could. Last fall, Robbie brought his own 10-year-old daughter along, and Walter caught her crouched at the edge of the field, studying a patch of grass that seemed to be growing faster than the rest, asking her father why. Walter doesn't tell it as a story about being right. He tells it as a story about paying attention. The land had been trying to say something for 3 generations, in nothing louder than a patch of grass that wouldn't stop growing. It took someone willing to watch quietly, get laughed at, and dig anyway, to finally listen. Most of what people call luck, Walter says, is really just 9 years of looking at the same patch of ground until it finally tells you what it's been trying to say all along. If this story reminded you that patience is its own kind of skill, subscribe and tap the like button before you go. Drop a comment telling us about a time you trusted your own observation over everyone else's opinion. We'll see you in the next story.